Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, my daughter decided to make pound cake from scratch this past week. She's been baking a lot this summer, and only issue this time is partway through, she discovered we didn't have all the sugar that she needed for the recipe. My wife explained that we could call one of our neighbors to see if they had some spare sugar. My daughter was very surprised at that concept and doubtful that this would be appropriate to ask or that if it was even something neighbors did. But Maria explained that this is the kind of thing neighbors have done for each other for ages. So it turned out that one of our neighbors did have some spare sugar, and she made the cake, and it was amazing. Have you ever shared something with a neighbor or borrowed an item? Do you think those interactions with neighbors are as common today as they were? Some of that is part of the fabric of a trusting, gracious, and hopeful community. Jesus asked people to imagine a similar kind of interaction between friends in today's gospel. One friend goes to another at midnight in this story and asks for some extra loaves of bread. It's kind of pushing things a little bit, but even with a friend who doesn't want to get up so late to help, Jesus says they'll probably help you at least because you're persistent. His point is this: ask and it will be given you, search and you will find, knock and the door will be opened for you. We usually hear these words as a lesson in persistence, which Jesus clearly identifies as a key point in the story, but it's also about trust and hope. Now, I'll be honest, I'm less likely to call the next door neighbor and ask for something like that, like sugar. I'll be the one to hop in the car and make a quick run to the grocery store for the sugar and get sidetracked with several other purchases while I'm there, finally coming home with the sugar 45 minutes later. Maria is smarter. It takes 5 minutes to call a neighbor, walk over and back. She also has more experience with the back and forth requests like that. I tend to be a bit more shy in that regard. As for door knocks in the middle of the night, I'm not sure how many of us would answer the door after dark these days. We live in a time when people are less trusting in general of anyone coming to their door, even during the day for that matter. Various polls point to a culture that is less trusting today than many years ago. It reminds me of some stories I heard shared by Peter Hitchens a number of years ago. Peter's brother, Christopher Hitchens, was a well-known writer and commentator and also a famous atheist. He lost a long battle with cancer in 2011 and wrote quite a bit about that process when he was alive. His brother Peter had also been an atheist earlier in life, but through a series of experiences as a foreign journalist was led to a life of Christian faith. Before Christopher's death, the two brothers made appearances rigorously debating each other and answering questions from audiences. In some of those appearances, Peter talked about his own acceptance of Christian faith and why it made sense to him. He described a visit he made to Mogadishu, Somalia during the UN intervention in the early to mid-90s. He had various brushes with death there and saw the terror people lived in on the street where he stayed. All the buildings had holes from bullets and shells from rival tribal factions. And he talked about coming home and a few weeks later seeing a picture of the very same street that he had stayed at. And the picture had been taken 20 years before. And as he described, it showed pleasantly dressed people strolling along well-kept sidewalks, expensive cars gliding up and down a smooth road, telephone kiosks, cafes. It was beautiful and peaceful. And his question was, what happens to a place in 20 years that can cause such a deterioration of society to occur? Hitchens also describes time he spent in Moscow for about 2 years around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He described it as a very curious civilization, which was not a civilization. There was very little civility on the street between people. Often as he went to the subway, he would hold open the very large, heavy doors for people behind him, and they would step back with a look of mistrust on their faces, as if he was playing a joke on them. They were completely unused to the idea that anyone might do this. There wasn't that kind of consideration. Nobody in any kind of public dealing would trust you. Almost everything had to be obtained in what he described as whispered threats and bribes. Peter wrote that near the end of the Soviet Union, he witnessed riots over changes in rations, bribes for anesthetics at the dentist or antibiotics at the hospital, mistrust and surveillance, unending official lies, manipulation and oppression, harsh incivility. Peter also noticed the growing public discourtesy and incivility in Britain as well. When he returned to London after being gone for 5 years, he was shocked by the decline in people's behavior. Peter looked at all of this and, in his own thinking, saw the lack of some kind of shared values. And it's easy to reflect on the difficulties that societies encounter, but not reflect honestly about our own. We certainly have our own issues today. I think we can all agree on that much. Most institutions in our country are at an all-time low in terms of trust. None are immune. It's worth asking how much is primarily about the institutions themselves or about people's expectations. We have a right to expect something between the wide space between perfection and inaction. You probably find yourself less trusting today than you were at one time, less hopeful when you reflect on the wider world and how things are going. We can choose to trust or not trust based on what we're observing outside of ourselves. But in the end, trust is also determined from within. There are some things we shouldn't trust, like scam emails and statements we know to be lies. Good judgment is as important as ever. But today I think it's equally important to set aside time to pause and reflect and quiet our assumptions and expectations, to seek out facts rather than simply what our own tribe or faction is saying, to put aside unfounded suspicions and embrace a more grounded hope. We will always find plenty of reasons to never trust again, whatever that might be. The true test for our souls and any society is to find reasons to embrace others and through our actions grant trust again. In the words of Jesus, to ask, seek, knock, so that we can discover there can indeed be a door that opens, a door to a better future, a door to a renewed relationship, a door to more in common than we expected previously. To goodwill we didn't know existed. It seems like too few knock on these kinds of doors anymore, and when they do, no one seems to answer, perhaps out of fear or distrust. Back in 2006, our family moved to the Cambridge-Isanti area, about an hour north of downtown Minneapolis, for those of you who don't know where that is. My only experience living in small towns prior to that was in college, which really isn't a small town experience, more of a campus life experience. And then I had 1 year of internship in a smaller town north of Seattle. So in my first couple of years in the Cambridge area, I was, kind of adjusting, and I met someone who had grown up in a small town, but had lived in various urban and suburban areas and small town settings since then. And it was an opportunity for me to ask him his insights on the differences between small town cultures and suburbs, and I was trying to put this all kind of in perspective myself, and I found his answer interesting. He talked about how in small towns you inevitably have to do business and see people every day that you might disagree with or not get along with, and so you learn to live together and respect each other no matter what. Sometimes in large metropolitan areas, people feel more ability and permission to avoid people, walk away, and even burn bridges. You probably won't see that person again. In small towns, you don't have that luxury, or at least not without greater consequences. And there are certainly plenty of exceptions both ways on that, but I think there's also some truth. Of course, today, social media, wherever you live, takes that to another level. It's easy to say anything and feel like the person you're talking to or talking about isn't even another human being. They're just this idea of a person out there somewhere. And when we're focused more on the idea of people somewhere else than the person that we need to buy bread from tomorrow or sit next to at the local school event, it kind of changes things. Trust and hope derive from continuing in relationship, from working through differences and hurt at times. But it requires our lasting commitment. And when we proceed with care, it matters. And we all fall short of that at times. We all could do better. In today's reading from Luke, Jesus is asked to give instruction on how to pray. His response is an abbreviated version of what we know as the Lord's Prayer. A fuller version can be found in Matthew's Gospel. But one of the parts of the Lord's Prayer is this: and forgive us our sins, for we ourselves forgive everyone indebted to us. Why should that be a part of a prayer that Jesus taught? Why did Jesus bother with that? It's part of how we come to peace ourselves and with one another. It's how we help establish a kinder and more trusting society, and part of how we find caring ways to move forward. Forgiveness is part of the work of reconciliation, seeking forgiveness from God, finding it, and then extending that forgiveness to others. Forgiveness hopes certainly for a change of heart. The father who runs out to his wayward son on his way home embraces him before he actually knows what he's going to say or whether he's truly changed his heart. Forgiveness is something we can choose to do regardless of the response. It has the power to heal our own soul, regardless of how it's received, even if we never even share it verbally with another person. Forgiveness is an action of peace and care. It assumes some degree of trust and hope. There is some risk involved, even if it's entirely internal to ourselves, the risk of vulnerability. Forgiveness doesn't mean we entirely forget as if that were possible, or that we call whatever action we were hurt by okay. But it's a decision to move on in some way. The practice of recognizing our own shortcomings and receiving forgiveness gives us new perspective. It's an experience of grace. It resets our perception of ourselves and others through a more realistic, but also more hopeful lens. And in 2022, I think we could use something like that to rediscover a little hope. Prayers like the one Jesus taught help bring the peace and strength to step out in new ways. It sets us out on an adventure of discovery. So the question is, what will your adventure be? If we're centered in prayer and in a place of peace and greater trust, maybe it will mean reaching out to someone for support or a little extra sugar. Maybe it will mean engaging in a relationship that has been difficult. Maybe that relationship even involves taking ownership for mistakes you've made and doing what you can to rebuild trust or goodwill, or extending forgiveness where you've been hurt. Adventures can take all kinds of shapes, but we're called to move forward with hope and trust that God is making all things new, and that if we ask, seek, and knock, looking for goodwill and help, that we'll find it. Maybe not every time, but maybe more often than we'd expect. By beginning with well-grounded trust and taking the risk, we can help build the kind of place, even the society, that we want to live in, where everyone can thrive. Any adventure can bring real challenges, but centering ourselves in prayer and faith can bring us the peace and perspective we need to press on with hope and care. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.